Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Great. Thanks for coming out, and thanks for the Truro Historical Society for having me. I'm going to talk a little bit about the background of how all this modern architecture ended up on the Outer Cape, and then a bit about our efforts to preserve and restore and repurpose some of these buildings. So, always like to start with the end of the last ice age. With the retreat of the last ice age, created Cape Cod, really kind of like a big snow plow with pushing sand and rock in front of it. And then when it retreated, left Cape Cod, the familiar shape. And where I'm going to be talking about mostly is the Wellfleet-Truro line on the ocean side, and also Boundbrook Island on the bay side. Which is where most of the modern houses are concentrated. So the Cape has been occupied by people for 3,000 to 4,000 years. The Wampanoag-speaking people came to the Cape, and their buildings were wigwams or wetus, which are made of bent saplings and birch bark, or mats made of reed. These were actually, this is a wetu being built on Harvard Yard by some Wampanoags. So the wetus were actually very comfortable, and the first European settlers that got here said that they were cozy and well heated and actually more comfortable than the first houses that they built, with a fire pit in the center and a flap for controlling the smoke. And so there was a layer of skin on the outside and a layer of skin on the inside, and then they slept on elevated platforms. So here you have, the first architecture on the Cape, and what it is, it's a very light frame, and then with a skin hung on that frame. And it's movable, so they would come down to the water's edge in the summer for fishing and shellfishing and catching eels, and then they would move their houses back into the woods for the winter during the harsh weather. But they would leave the frame there. They would take the skin and reuse the skin constantly. So this is, and also if you wanted to make it bigger, you would just extend it. So you see these very long ones for extended families. But this idea of a light frame with a light skin hung on it, flexibility, reusing parts, movability, extendability, these are all kind of earmarks, and we'll see that that's carried on when Europeans got here. So the Cape's terrain, of course, is always changing. Wind, erosion, nothing is permanent, everything's constantly in motion, so buildings have to be flexible. Another theme on the Outer Cape is utilitarian buildings being repurposed for cultural functions. So this became the Long Point Theater. It was the first, Eugene O'Neill's first play was performed here. It was an old fish house. It later burned down, but his first play was performed there with people sitting on planks, on barrels, and people holding kerosene lamps, and the water was lapping underneath. And this was, this is a reuse of a practical building for a cultural purpose. Of course, buildings on the Cape have always been moved very often. This is a house that was out at Long Point in Provincetown, which was being moved into the center of town on a raft. So there were fishing communities which became defunct, and all those buildings were moved. Actually, Boundbrook Island had many old houses on it, and when the harbor silted up, they moved all those houses to Wellfleet Center. So almost every old house in Wellfleet used to be somewhere else, or part of it used to be somewhere else. Also, soon after Europeans arrived, most of the trees were cut down, so there was a wood shortage and scarcity of materials. And shipwrecks were very frequent. In Thoreau's Cape Cod, he talks about seeing one of these shipwrecks and the townspeople coming out to disassemble the ship, because the maritime rules were that if a ship landed within a town's boundaries, it belonged to the people of that town, so they would go out and take the ship apart and reuse the wood. So very often you'll find pieces of old ships in houses. So this is the end of Black Pond Road in Truro. This is Black Pond Road is the road that sort of is on the Wellfleet-Truro line and goes all the way. That's Horseleech Pond, if you've ever been there, and that's the Atlantic beyond to the right. So this was, you can see, this is taken around in the late 30s, and this is deforested. The Outer Cape was pretty much totally deforested, and the back shore, parts of Truro are still like this, was just a rolling heath you could see for miles. If you could get up on a hill, you could see all 7 ponds are in that area. So very different today with the pitch pines. This was really like a rolling moor. So there were 3 American self-taught architects who came to Wellfleet in the late 30s. Jack Phillips, seen here, Jack Hall, and Hayden Wallen. They were all from good families, New England families, and they had gone to good schools, but they were kind of bohemians. They had all been to Paris, they'd all studied art, and then they had seen early modern architecture in Europe, and then came back to the States and made their way to the Outer Cape and either inherited or bought big pieces of land. So in case of Jack Phillips, he inherited 800 acres from his great-uncle, which comprised that whole section on the Wellfleet-Truro line. So that includes all those ponds and all the way from Route 6 to the ocean. Now that being said, this was, during the Depression, this land was almost worthless. There was $20 an acre in the Depression to buy land on the backside. That was considered worthless land because there was mosquitoes and you couldn't grow anything, you couldn't moor your boat there. So these were basically wood lots. Every family had a wood lot. And then when kerosene came in, nobody needed their wood lot, so this was just abandoned land. So his great uncle bought it as a giant bird preserve and started living on the site right by, at the end of Black Pond Road. The end of Black Pond next to Horseleech, he had a camp and he would live there year-round. So Jack Phillips went to Harvard and he inherited this land when he turned 21. And he came to Wellfleet and started living there year-round and kind of homesteading off the grid. He had a turkey growing, raising farm for a while. And this is his, I think he was married 5 times. I think this is wife number 3. This is Magoosh was her name, very interesting woman. She just died in Paris 2 years ago. He started building things on this 800 acres, kind of based on the modern architecture he had seen in Europe. But these were very simple buildings made a lot of with salvaged material. And this was the first modern building he built, which was a studio, painting studio, called the Bug House, and it later fell over the dune due to erosion. But see, this is the interior of that. He made this big window wall facing north because this was a painting studio, but he used old window sashes from old buildings and just literally wood that washed up on the beach. So these were truly buildings in that tradition of salvaging and repurposing wood. These guys were all from wealthy families, but they always seemed to be broke for some reason. I think it was because they got married so many times, they had a lot of children and alimony. But anyway, he continued to build on that 800 acres, and just after the war, he bought a trainload of old army barracks, prefab army barracks. And he put up 5 of those, and they're all still there. And actually, this is the home of Arthur Schlesinger, the historian who was in Kennedy's cabinet, and this looks exactly the same today, and the Schlesingers still live there. So this is a sort of Thoreauvian idea of the cabin in the woods, and none of these houses had electricity. They had a water pump in the yard and an outhouse. And there's a kind of reverse snobbery where the more famous you were, the smaller your house was. So also, that's that same prefab army barrack with this. And sitting in front of us is Charles Jenks, who's a very famous postmodern architect who was sort of the what came after modernism. But he grew up partly in Wellfleet, and his own house is at the very end of Black Pond Road, and it's 3 of those army barracks put together. This house has been moved twice back from the eroding dune, and that's the view from his front door. So he's lucky he has a long lot and he can keep moving the building back. Other people not so lucky. So Charles Jenks, being the anti-modernist, he liked classicism and all of the sort of historical references. So this is his building he calls the Garaggia Rotunda, which is a prefabricated one-car garage with all of these sort of hardware store moldings and gewgaws painted all these different colors of blue based on the Villa Rotunda by Palladio. And anyway, this is sort of Folly in the Woods, which was his studio. It's still there, and actually the Victoria and Albert Museum 2 years ago had a big show on postmodernism, and they built a piece of the Garaggia Rotunda in the gallery. So another one of those 3 American sort of self-taught architects was Jack Hall. He came to Boundbrook Island in the late 30s and bought 150 acres with this old farmhouse on it. This house had been abandoned for many years. Wellfleet in the Depression got down to less than 400 people. So there were a lot of empty houses. The Outer Cape has always had a kind of boom-bust thing, and the population has fluctuated. So there are a lot of empty houses. This house was built in the 1730s. And this was the birthplace of Lorenzo Dow Baker, who was the ship captain who figured out how to ship bananas green and became a millionaire and his company became the United Fruit Company. But anyway, Jack Hall bought this house, and you can see all the way to the bay there with no trees. And started kind of homesteading here. He turned it into a farm. He was raising livestock. He was a self-taught painter. And he started building things. At first, he started taking old barns from around and putting them back together. These are post and beam buildings. So again, you have the frame and the skin. The skin was a thin skin of boards. And he kept his Rolls Royce in this. This is the second house he lived in, which his family still owns, which was another house from the early 1700s. And he had this interesting attitude toward these houses. This group of people, they all loved real antique historic buildings, but they also loved modernism, and they would often just mash them together. So he would blow these giant plate glass windows into the back of them and do these modern additions, not in a self-conscious way. He just liked both. And so this is sort of an unusual local vernacular form of architecture here that all 3 of these guys did, which was a sort of combination of old and new. So his great achievement, I think, is the Hatch House, built in '61, which is a modular building based on a 7 by 7 foot cube in a sort of superstructure, and there are buildings broken up so that you have to go outdoors to go between the rooms in some cases. This is a picture of it under construction. And for 2 years, so he never went to architecture school, but he did work for the great designer George Nelson for 2 years before he did the Hatch House. And he went to Russia and worked on this USAID exhibition in a park in Moscow. And he helped build this thing called the Jungle Gym, which was a giant scaffolding structure for displaying US products. So as you see, if you look at sort of the bottom left, this is really the Hatch House at a different scale and with some different materials. But but conceptually it's a superstructure with panels to create walls and roofs and floors. Also in George Nelson's office around that time was an idea for a prefabricated aluminum house made of cubes connected by walkways. This was never built, but he would have seen this project, and conceptually very similar, these walkways connecting cubes. So this is a picture of the house soon after construction. The clients were Robert Hatch, who was the editor of The Nation magazine, and his wife Ruth, who was a painter. So you can see there's no wall cavity, there's no insulation. What you're seeing is the back of the siding. So once again, this very light frame, in this case the frame extends past the walls, and these sort of light skin apply. This is not a heated or insulated building, it's just seasonal. And actually when this was built, it had no power. There was a water pump in the kitchen and kerosene lamps. So there you can see the three separate structures where you have to go outside. The Hatch family did add another cube on the far right there, which made one of the bedrooms bigger. So they followed all the rules of the modular rules when they increased the size. And the other thing about the Hatch house is that it opens and closes. So these big hatches or shutters open, and when the building is, the first time I saw this building in the winter, I couldn't tell what it was. I thought it was a storage thing for lobster pots or something, because you couldn't see any doors or windows. Everything was closed up. And then in the summer, the whole thing opens and it's very light and airy. So I started the trust in 2007 in order to try to save a few of these buildings which had fallen into the ownership of the National Park Service. So basically in '59, I think there's some of the show that talks about this, but in 1959, the legislation to create the national parks, national seashore, was introduced, and people thought about it for 2 years. A lot of people were opposed to the park, especially people that owned large pieces of land that intended to develop them. But it passed in '61. But if you started building in that 2-year period, you were gambling, and those people lost that gamble. And in '61, the park bought them out and gave them 25 years, and at which point they had to vacate, and the park was supposed to demolish those buildings. So, because of money and entropy, the park never did demolish them, most of them. So, fortunately, they lasted long enough so that they became historic. So this is actually the second house that we leased from the park. It was in a pretty bad shape when we got it because the family knew they were going to lose the house to the park, so they kind of stopped taking care of it. So we had to rebuild the decks and the roof and the plumbing and electrical and septic and everything. And this is the deck, which is 1x4 fir, but instead of being flat, it's vertical, which is very interesting. It's kind of like you're floating and the water just passes through. And that's the view there of the bay with the shutters open. We were very fortunate with this house is that we got the furniture, the art, and the books of the Hatch family. Since we were already talking to them, Ruth Hatch lived in the house until she was 93 on a special year-to-year lease from the park. So we were already we were talking to Ruth before she passed away, and the family put everything in storage. And then when we finished the restoration, the family put everything back. So the other houses, we really have to try to recreate the furniture and art and interiors, but in this case, we got all the books. So this was a kind of a salon, literary salon, this house. Noam Chomsky and Howard Zinn were very good friends, and I have pictures of them all together because Robert Hatch was the editor of The Nation. So this was kind of a little think tank here. The third of those Americans was Hayden Walling. He came to the Cape also as he was only 18 when he bought some land from Jack Phillips. He was very interesting. His parents, he came to the Cape because his parents were Americans, kind of famous American socialists who were friends with John Reed and were hanging around with that group of people in Provincetown. And he bought this piece of land on Slough Pond and started assembling pieces of old buildings and putting them together. So the tower used to be in Wellfleet Center, part of the water tower. And he actually used old bricks and locust beams that were part of an old settlement out there. But on the interior, it's very modern. So again, you have this combination of antique and modern. Hayden Walling became a very good builder and built a lot of houses for other architects, but he never learned to draw, and he didn't really plan buildings. He would show up and just start building them. This is the Lachey house in Wellfleet, the home of the painter James Lachey, and you can see he's reusing old barn wood there. And this is the studio. A lot of the first buildings that were built by these guys were studios for painters. This building is made of plywood and plate glass. It's very, very simple. And these were very inexpensive buildings. So, you know, $5,000, $10,000 total budget for building them. This is the Halpern House by, which is up above Horseleech Pond. And of course, if you're a modern architect, you want a big glass wall. Of course, they couldn't get big pieces of plate glass, so he just made a regular stud wall and then put plate glass strips to get this effect of this big glass wall. So at the same time, in the late 30s, the Bauhaus School was well, in the early 30s, the Bauhaus, which was this great school in Germany that was the sort of crucible of modern design, architecture, furniture, painting, all metalwork, industrial design, and started by Walter Gropius in 1919. And the idea he had was basically to take the new techniques of the Industrial Revolution and mass production of reinforced concrete and glass and steel, and to combine them with the tradition of German handcrafts, of like the old guild system of weaving and woodwork, and so at the Bauhaus, it was an experimental sort of art and design school. You had to become an expert in one of those fields: woodwork, metalwork, weaving, architecture, and there was one master of each of those subjects, and you had to enter it like a guild. So the Nazis closed the last version of the Bauhaus, and in the early 30s, this is the Bauhaus in Dessau, which designed by Gropius, and it looks like a factory. It's sort of like a factory for art. But this was very revolutionary at the time, this sort of glass curtain wall with no supports on the wall. So there's a steel skeleton with the glass, and the structure is held back from the wall. This wasn't used in, it was being used in factories, but it wasn't being used in institutional buildings or residential buildings at the time. So one of the youngest students there was Marcel Breuer, who's Hungarian, came to the Bauhaus at 18. And at a very young age, discovered and invented tubular steel furniture. This is him in the Vasily chair, which he named after Kandinsky, his friend. And the Cheska chair, which is sort of the culmination of his ideas on design. He always had a duality between the structural, industrial, mass-produced part, and then the sort of soft, man-made part that you come into contact with. So the steel allows you to do this kind of very radical at the time cantilever where there's no back legs, and then the part you come into contact with is this soft, hand-wrought leather. This is probably the most reproduced chair in the world. You find it in gas stations in Bangladesh or wherever you go, you'll see this chair. So Gropius had this kind of inner circle of friends. This is Herbert Bayer and Zonti Shavinsky and Gropius. They were always going skiing and going to lakes in Switzerland and when they were at the Bauhaus. This group all went to Europe, all went to London after the Bauhaus was closed. And then in 1937, Harvard asked Gropius to take over Harvard's architecture school and teach the Bauhaus curriculum. So this really, and then Breuer came with him. So Breuer and Gropius really taught the great generation of American modern architects, Ian Pei and Philip Johnson, and all the people who went on to build, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, were mostly students of Breuer and Gropius. So they spent the first summer in 37 on Planting Island in Marion, which is on Buzzards Bay. And then they all spread out. Breuer Gropius went to Harvard. Others went to Chicago and New York and spread out over the country. In the center there is Moholy Nagy, who was the fundamentals teacher at the Bauhaus. He went to Chicago and started the new Bauhaus. And Zonti Shavinsky there on the left taught at Black Mountain College. And Herbert Bayer did the first big show at MoMA of the Bauhaus, and then went to Aspen and was part of that whole Aspen Institute. He was a graphic designer. So these guys always seem to be having a good time, in spite of the fact that they were all refugees, and sometimes were refugees many times over. That is Zonti on the right, and then Jose Luis Sert in the center, who became the Dean of Architecture at Harvard after Gropius. And this is them reenacting the statue of Neptune and the sons fighting the sea serpent. Breuer's kind of in there in the back, and this is Mary Barnes, who was one of Philip Johnson's. She was interior designer and worked at MoMA, and then married Edward Laramie Barnes and became an important architect too. So the first of the Europeans that came out to Wellfleet of this group, after the Europeans spread out, kind of got established and started teaching and got a little bit of money, they started to come back to the Cape and buy land. So the first one was Serge Tremaeff, whose house is on Slough Pond. His wife Barbara, Ivan Tremaeff, and Peter Tremaeff. Ivan Tremaeff just passed away, but he was a very famous graphic designer. And Peter is an architect that designed the New England Aquarium and aquariums all over the world. But Tremaeff was Russian, educated in Britain, and came to that 800 acres and bought a piece of land. And actually, when he first got to this house, it was just a hunting cabin, which was this end with the chimney. It was a little one-room cabin, and then he kept adding on and adding on. Now it's a sort of a compound. And he had this idea for a sort of lightweight studio building, which would be expandable and easy to construct. This is the first version of that, his studio in Wellfleet, which was a painting studio. So you can see it's almost like playing cards, or very light. Those colorful panels were actually originally made of homosote, which is pressed paper. So they were almost like temporary buildings or stage sets. And later they were replaced with plywood and all these. He built 7 versions of this in Wellfleet, and they're all still standing. This is one of the windows in that house. This is the longest one that he built originally, which was the Wilkinson House, which is right by the tennis courts at the top of Grosse Hill Road by Newcomb Hall. He also did one commercial version of this building, which was the old Cape Codder printery in Orleans, but no longer standing. So Tremaeff's house became a real think tank for a group of architects. On the left there is Bernard Rudovsky, architect, and did many important shows at the Museum of Modern Art. Chermayeff in the middle, and on the right is Jerry Kepish, who started the Center for Advanced Visual Studies at MIT, which sort of became the Media Lab and the ACT program. So these guys were all interested in design. They were very sort of anti-formal, very interested in the end user, very interested in what can be learned from pre-industrial cultures. So Rudovsky wrote the book Architecture Without Architects, which is all about how pre-industrial cultures dealt with architectural problems. So by the mid-40s, this crowd was in Wellfleet. That's Gropius and Zonti Shavinsky and his assistant, Aunt Mary's Pond, and right on the Wellfleet Trail line. And this is 1945. They took turns living in an ice house that was on their pond, because all the ponds used to have ice houses where they would store the ice when they cut it up. But they became perfect art studios because they were just a great big room. Marcel Breuer came to visit Chermayeff in the mid-40s and bought a piece of land where he originally envisioned a cottage colony. Only one of these houses got built in that location, which was his own house. And he originally envisioned this as what he called a longhouse, which is an elevated wooden house set up on piers with some kind of a cantilevered porch. So that's that long part on the left. He would then have sort of a studio section he could add as a B part. There are 4 versions of this house in Wellfleet, and some of them are very original, and some of them have the B part. This is the Wise House at the end of Indian Neck, which is the A and the B part. And this is Breuer in 1950 at his house. He ended up enclosing the porch with a roof and screens. And instead of being hung by cables, there's a sort of a hanging truss supporting it. Breuer referred to the house up on stilts as being like a house, like looking at it through a camera on a tripod, that you were up in the air and you kind of get right to where you want to be, and then you can survey the landscape. So this house is hanging out over a drop over Williams Pond, and he could see 3 ponds. So this was he would figure out where the ideal spot was, and that's where the porch would be. And the Kepish house is an almost exact replica, and it's the same thing. A family spends all day on the porch. This is where everything happens. They eat there, they hang out there all day, and they're really beautiful spaces that you feel like you're floating in a box. This is the interior of Breuer's living room. He made this very interesting furniture. Actually, at first there was no furniture, and in the early pictures there's a sort of mattress in the living room and a picnic table, and that's it. There was this sort of Japanese extreme minimalism. Later on, he made this interesting furniture out of just chunks of structural wood. So those couches are made out of 4x8s and then planks, and then the coffee tables are just cement blocks. He was always using cement blocks kind of like they were fine objects, and in some cases he makes them kind of look like Doric columns or something.
Who did the carpet?
The carpets were designed by Breuer and his wife, and I actually have one of these carpets, but they created a kind of little cottage industry. Calder, Rufus Stillman, a group of people designed these, and at first they were making them themselves, and then they had them made in Morocco later. This is the house today. It actually fell into quite a bad disrepair, and we're slowly working with Breuer's son to restore it. So this is Zonti Shavinsky later in life, sitting in the middle there telling a story in the porch, and Breuer's wife, Connie, on the right. This woman on the left couldn't identify for a long time. but finally found her. She's still alive. She's Christina Bevington, and she's French Senegalese, and I think she was one of the only women of color who was a registered architect. She was working in Breuer's office in the 60s. That's a view from the porch today. So there's this sort of levitating feeling. And we've been replacing the siding. The siding was falling off, and as I say, we're slowly restoring that house. This is Jerry Kepish and his wife Juliet, who is a children's book illustrator and writer. And this is their house in Cambridge, where they created this whole environment for their kids with murals and trees they could climb and so forth. We did a show 2.5 years ago in Wellfleet. We did a show at the Wellfleet Historical Society about all the children's books produced by this group of people, which was over 200 children's books that the modernists, Outer Cape modernists did. And she actually won the Caldecott Award for one of her books, and her illustrations are wonderful. This is that exhibit. This is the Kepish house, which is very original, like tatami mats on the floor, very rough kind of cabin. Breuer was always kind of upgrading his, but the Kepishes, it's just left it as a very raw cabin. It's a wise house. And this is the Stillman house out on Griffin Island, which unfortunately has been moved twice due to erosion and kind of mangled both times. So I had heard there was a Breuer house in Dennis, like a high-budget, fancy Breuer house, and nobody could find it. I asked everyone in Dennis, no one had ever heard of it. Yes. And the Scott house, but I knew that it was 2 separate bars. This was Breuer's other main house design. He called it binuclear, and it was the idea is to separate the noisy and the quiet part of the house. And he had this theory that men returning from the war needed a lot of peace and quiet, so the children's wing was always separate. In this case, it's actually 2 separate buildings. This Life magazine put all their photo archive online, and somebody sent me this link, said, look at this, because there's a Breuer article from 1950, which was never run actually in Life, but it was the photo archive. So I knew that this was the Scott house because of the plan, and so I got this reporter at the Cape Cod Times interested, and she went to the registry of deeds, and she actually found a deed and found an address, and the house is there. It's completely mint, all the original furniture. The original family owns it, and that was quite amazing. So this is obviously not a cabin; it's more of a high-end house. And the radiant heat still works in the floor. This is the courtyard in between. You can see the back part of this house is based on it actually predates Breuer's house he did in the Museum of Modern Art Garden, which was a demonstration house that I think over 1 million people saw, which was sort of trying to sell modern house design to the general public. This house was later cut in half and moved to Quantico, New York, where it's now an artist residency. So also in that gang was Paul Weidlinger, also Hungarian. He's a great structural engineer. Came to Wellfleet in 1953 to visit Breuer and bought some land. And he was a real pioneer in parabolic concrete structures. He did the Beinecke Library at Yale, which is this amazing sort of cage made of concrete with these sheets of stone. This is the rare book library at Yale. And he was called into Breuer's projects when there was problems like this accordion concrete ceiling was collapsing as they were pouring it, and he solved that problem. So he was a very innovative engineer, and he kind of wrote the book on blast-proofing structures. So his firm did the analysis of the World Trade Center collapse, and they were the consultants for all the finalists for the new World Trade Center. So he built this house for himself in '53, and then the park acquired it and let staff live in there, and then when it got too run down, they just abandoned it, and it was supposed to be demolished. So this was the third house we restored, and it was kind of on the edge of being savable. A big tree had crushed one of the corners, and there's a plan. And see, this was the biggest challenge, this door, which was an 8 by 16 foot sliding glass door. And at the time, no U.S. company made sliding glass door that big, but we had an artist in residence from Austria, and he hooked us up with a company who donated the 3 doors we needed for this house. So we did have to get them here from Austria, though, and install them. So that's a plan of the Weidlinger house. And this is it after the restoration. It's on Higgins Pond in Wellesley. Right across from Breuer's house. So Breuer's house is on the way around. Bedroom. Some other, so there's over 120 modern houses that are found on the Outer Cape. There's 4 Breuer houses and 7 by Tremaya, and then Charlie Zender, who some of you might know, have known, he did over 52 houses I found in Wellfleet and Truro, and our family grew up in a Zender house. When I was 10, Zender did a house for my family, which is kind of how I got into this whole modern house thing. So, and then there were some others who kind of did one-off, did one modern house, and this was Paul Kruger. He's done many houses in Wellfleet and Truro, but after that he switched to traditional buildings. But this was a rather radical building he did in the early 60s, which is still there. The Mark House, which is 3 stories and 12 feet wide. And this is the original kitchen, and it's still just that way, 2 burners and a under-counter fridge. So take that, kitchen designers. But the whole building is kind of like a bridge. It's a very strong sort of cross-brace truss structure. Based on the apartments, he was the architect in charge of the only building by Le Corbusier in North America, which is the Carpenter Center at Harvard. So he worked with Corbusier very closely, and then the building by Corbusier in Marseille is called the Unité de Habitation, which I don't have a picture of, but this is one of the apartments, and they're 12 feet wide, and they're 2 stories tall. So in effect, this house is kind of like one of the apartments taken out of a high-rise and freestanding. There's the Marks. He was a minister at a church in Harvard Square. Another architect here, Olaf Hammerstrom, who built this house over by Newcomb Hollow. Finnish architect who taught at Cranbrook and was worked for Saarinen and Aalto, the great Finnish architects. He always had a big breezeway through the center of his houses, and so he had these barn doors that you could open entirely and just sort of indoor-outdoor. But this house was actually, in its original form, was a little cube that was heated, and then the living room was a sort of summer pavilion. So if you came here off-season, all the plumbing and the sleeping areas were in this little cube so that you could heat them. He designed the Saarinen house on Herring Pond in Wellfleet. The Saarinen family owned that until recently, sold a few years ago. Also in Wellfleet is the Colony, on Chequesset Neck Road, which was designed by Saltonstall and Morton. Nathaniel Saltonstall actually designed this as the main building was a gallery. And the idea is that Bostonian art collectors could come down and stay in the cottages and see the work of local artists. So it was a sort of a way to promote local artists. You've probably seen this driving by. There's this sort of panels of concrete. So Charlie Zender was a generation younger. He was at Korean War. He was in the Marines in the Korean War and came to Wellfleet in the late 50s and bought some land when it was still affordable and started building houses. As I say, he built 52 that I found. Very innovative, and he actually never studied architecture either. He went to RISD in sculpture, and when he was at UVA undergrad, he met Frank Lloyd Wright. Frank Lloyd Wright had this lifelong effect on him, and he incorporated a lot of Wright's ideas. This is one of the poured concrete houses he did when poured concrete was very cheap. This is in the 70s, and he got connected with a company that did parking garages, and he did 3 of these poured concrete houses in Wellfleet. This is the Brodeur house, lived in by Paul Brodeur, who's a New Yorker writer, and he still lives there. I always thought, so Zender's big influences were Frank Lloyd Wright, Thomas Jefferson, and these fortifications at Normandy, which he visited many times. And I always thought that was very odd until I saw them, and they're really amazing buildings. So these were German fortifications built during World War II. Talk about sculpture. Now that's brutalism. That's brutalism. But he was very good. He was very talented draftsman. This is a house that we grew up in. It's been altered a few times, but this isn't a great picture, but it was sort of 3 wedge shapes, and it was a very very interesting house spatially. And it has been altered a few times, but the building is still in there. So the first house that we restored was by Charlie Zender. This is the Cooper Gibbs house, and this is the first one we did. It was abandoned for 11 years and was in very bad shape. The roof had failed, and the decks had rotted all the way through, and things on the Cape, unattended buildings rot very quickly. Because pine needles pile up, and then they get wet, and then they rot through, and then raccoons get in, and So, but this is a beautiful building. You can really see the Frank Lloyd Wright influence with these big cantilevers and these corners, butt glass corners where the corner glass just meets glass. He also, as I say, he never studied architecture, and he's doing his own very idiosyncratic approach with this. You see this plan. It's not a box. It's really like a whole series of boxes sort of connected. This is what it looked like when we got it. And this is the part of the reconstruction. So some other people who were around in that time period, who many of them either stayed with Breuer or Tremaya back on Slough Pond. Conrad Voxman, who's sort of the father of the space frame. Space frames are sort of 3-dimensional trusses where you can span enormous areas. This is one of his drawings before computers. It's like a pen and ink drawing. He and Gropius designed a prefab house system called the General Panel Company. That's Gropius and Voxman. And Ati Gropius's daughter, lived in Wellfleet until she passed away a few years ago. And she said that, Voxman was always in the house, and after dinner they'd go down in the basement and work on the prefab design. This whole Saarinen family, that's Eero Saarinen on the right, and Florence Knoll on the left. Florence Knoll grew up kind of with the Saarinens at Cranbrook in Michigan. She was orphaned, and then they sort of raised her, and she was a great furniture designer in her own right, but she also licensed all the great mid-century furniture that you see as Knoll furniture now. So she got licensing agreements with all of these great architects to mass produce their furniture. Alvar Aalto, the Finnish architect, who came here in 1945 while he was teaching at MIT, and did this drawing called Cape Cod Hurricane. So basically, we've restored 3 houses where we rent them in the summer to kind of pay the bills. We do an artist residency in the spring and fall, and then we do house tours and other programs connected with kind of bringing attention and scholarship to the mid-century community that was here, and also just work of the artists. This is another Hammerstrom house, the Nimitz house. This was the Admiral Nimitz's house in Wellfleet. And this is the Chermayeff, the big room in his compound where we had this conference on urban-rural design issues a few years ago. So we're actually trying to bring some of that spirit back to these places where these meetings happened in the mid-century. I wrote a book called Cod Modern, and I have some copies if anybody wants a signed copy, which really gives you the entire backstory of all of this. We may be restoring a 4th house over this winter, the Kohlberg House, which is over near Newcomb Hollow. It's also been empty for a long time, since the late 90s. So, but it has a good view. Yeah, great, so, thank you.